I'm sure that's built into your presentation. So listen, it's great to have you here, Jeremy.
Thanks. Sorry I'm a little bit behind today. Just came from a meeting over on the west side of town with a bunch of business folks who heard this same kind of spiel, who are going to help us get involved over the holidays to make sure that families have food, and so that's really exciting. But that presentation went a little bit over, and I don't know whether it was I talked too much or they asked too many questions, but nonetheless, it's really good to be with you today. I want to go back to 1964 to start this today. How many of you were, I'm just kidding, don't answer that question. 1964, though, was a very important year for the United States, and that was because Lyndon Baines Johnson, in his State of the Union address, said that a full-scale war on poverty was going to be declared. And from the courthouse, he said it this way, from the courthouse to the White House to every community, city, state across the United States, we're going to do whatever we can to eradicate poverty in the United States. He said it's improbable that the richest country in the world has people in it that can't afford to put food on their table. So in 1964, the Congress and Lyndon Baines Johnson worked together to establish the Food Stamp Act. 1964, food stamps were created. 1964, free and reduced lunch programs for students across our country were created. All of this idea of partnership was really generated between Congress, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and many folks across the country who said that it was improbable that the richest country in the world could not afford to feed its own citizens. In 1964, the conversation was centered around how we could best help people put food on their table and get out of poverty. And for 15 years, things worked very, very, very well. In 1979, there were 200 food banks across the United States. Only 200. To give you some perspective, there are 43 in Lawrence and Douglas County today. 200 in 1979 food banks across the United States. Less than 1 million hungry people. So just let that sink in for a moment. That's one food bank for every 1,250 people, roughly, at those numbers. It was a government, it was a private, it was a nonprofit, it was a social, it was a church and religious organization responsibility to ensure that nobody went hungry. Well, in 1980, something happened, and I won't get into my own political assertions as to what took place that I believe might have contributed to what I believe is the where everything went wrong and all hell broke loose. But the mindset kind of shifted in 1980 as a country, and we stopped asking how we were going to best help people, and we started asking whether or not it was our responsibility to help them at all. And all of these programs in the name of tax cuts began to be created. And you know, how many of you in this room want lower taxes? Well, really?
Yeah.
Not everybody wants, come on, how many of you guys want lower taxes? I mean, that's, to me, if you were to ask a low-income person that, do you want to pay lower taxes? They would say, yep. If you were to ask a majority of people in our country, do you want lower taxes? See, you didn't raise your hand because you knew what the follow-up question was, and that was, do you know what you're going to have to give up in order to get that? So let's say that the answer is nothing. How many of you want lower taxes? Okay, more hands at the river gonna. But the question was never asked, and it was kind of sold as this. Opportunity for people in our country to have a better opportunity to be more successful, and everything was going to be great. Things were going to be wonderful, and unfortunately, they just weren't. And so the responsibility really shifted from kind of a governmental responsibility in 1980 and a cooperative responsibility to, well, doesn't it make more sense, this is how it was sold this way, doesn't it make more sense for people in their own communities to take care of people in their communities that have needs? And it makes sense that Lawrence and Douglas County, right? I mean, doesn't this make sense that we can take care of our own here better than the government can take care of our own? And doesn't that just make sense that it's your neighbors and it's your friends and it's your family and it's people across the street from you, and we all need to do what we can to take care of each other? And of course, everybody was kind of sold that idea, and it was yes. And so the number of food banks began to double and triple and quadruple, and today there's 40,000 food banks, by the way. So that's a ratio of one food bank for every 5,000. I'm sorry, I said it wrong earlier. It was one food bank for every 5,000 people in 1979. Today it's one food bank for every 1,250 people
that are hungry.
And there's 50 million hungry people today in our country. So this whole idea that it is a local community's responsibility to take care of people that are hungry has, in my opinion, failed miserably. It goes without saying that programs that sustain families that have been around since the mid-1960s, I question whether or not they're going to be around in the next 20 years at all. Our food stamp programs have been relegated to $4.17 a day. And when all of these cuts started happening, and all of these new nonprofits and churches started opening up food pantries, religious organizations started opening up food pantries, everybody in our country had to absorb the just massive load of going from, we have a lot of government participation and a lot of money that's being given to sustain families, to now that's being cut significantly, and now people that were getting $300, $400, $500, $600 a month are getting $15, $20, and $50 a month to eat. And so all of these organizations kind of started to be birthed, and they would go to people in their communities and they would say, we need help feeding people in our community. Give us money, give us resources, give us time, volunteer with us, etc., etc. And so people started donating money, and all of these nonprofits and religious organizations would go to the grocery store, or they would go to wholesale grocers, and they would try to source the very things that were the cheapest for them to provide. So they would go to Checkers, and they would say, what can we get a lot of for a small amount of money? Well, you get macaroni and cheese, it's pretty cheap. Canned pasta is pretty cheap. Hamburger Helper is pretty cheap. Canned vegetables that are loaded in sodium, pretty cheap. And it's interesting that as the number of hungry people has risen exponentially since 1980, on the same line, so has the number of people that are malnourished and obese. At the expense of trying to solve one problem, we've created two more. And I give you all of that background story to say, last summer, our organization started to do some evaluation on its effectiveness. The poverty rate in Douglas County is 23.2%. That is to say that there are 23.2% of people in this county that are in poverty, bless you. There are 18.9% of people in this county that are, and I'll go on my tirade about food insecurity in a moment, that are food insecure. Now, let me just say this about food insecurity. We do not call people that are homeless, we do not call them shelter insecure. We do not call people who do not have an ability to get an education insecure. There's something about the term hunger and being hungry that didn't sit well with people in Washington, D.C., so they've coined this phrase to help themselves sleep better at night. The reality is, people in our country that don't have food on their table, that are not eating tonight, they're not food insecure, they're hungry. And although we think of the Sarah McLachlan commercial singing the sad songs as she's holding starving babies in Africa, And we think that that's the definition of hunger and that it doesn't happen here. The reality is that hunger happens around the world, but it also happens across the street. Maybe in such a way that's not as pronounced as somebody whose ribs that you can see holding in somebody's hand, but the effects of hunger and malnourishment and obesity are so prevalent in our culture today, seen in massive increases of numbers since 1980 until 2013. There's my rant on food insecurity. When you hear people say food insecurity, please politely correct them to say what I believe is the right phrase, and that is that people are hungry. So last summer, 2012, we came to the table with our clients and we began to ask them some questions. All of this centered around the fact that I had a conversation with our sustainability coordinator from the city and county, Eileen Horn. And Eileen said that sanitation workers had noted that in Christmas of 2011, in areas where we had a lot of clients, people were throwing turkeys away that we had provided. And I was mad, you know? I was angry, I was incensed, I was livid at the thought that we worked hours upon hours, 15 to 20 hours a day, providing Thanksgiving and Christmas meals for low-income families in our community. And why did they throw the turkeys away? I would come to groups like this and I would say, holidays are coming up. We need your money because it's expensive to provide people with turkeys. It's not the stuff that's cheap for us to get, and people would write checks and would give resources. And how embarrassing was it that our clients weren't even eating it? Like, it's an outrage. Well, until we started asking our clients why that happened. It's funny, isn't it, that we make assumptions about people's intentions without really ever asking them the questions. Most of the time we don't ask them the questions because we don't want to hear the answers. See, we were just assuming that we were doing such an incredible job. We patted ourselves on the back because we served a lot of people and distributed a lot of pounds of food. We serve over 10,000 people a month, and last year we distributed 1.7 million pounds of food, and that was double what 2011 was. And we patted ourselves on the back and would go home every day feeling so good about what we were doing without ever really asking the question, were we really getting anything accomplished at all? See, people in pounds, the measurements that are used across food banks all across our country, people in pounds cover a multitude of sins. And we never really asked our clients the question, what is it that you need in order to climb out of poverty and stay out? So we had some focus groups last summer. We surveyed our clients. And we asked them specifically about Christmas and turkeys. And here's what we found. Clients didn't know how to cook turkeys. They didn't know that you had to thaw them out. They didn't have the capacity in their freezer to put a turkey. They didn't have the proper pan to put the turkey in and couldn't afford one. The heat had gotten turned off at their house, the gas, so they didn't even have a stove to prepare a turkey in. And all of a sudden, last Christmas, when we all went home Christmas Eve night and felt so good about what we had accomplished, all of a sudden our team looked back on that holiday season and thought, we thought we did a lot of good for a lot of families, but the truth is that we didn't meet the need like we should have. Everything must change. So we essentially, do you remember Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner?
Oh, yeah.
And do you remember how the Roadrunner would just play hilarious jokes on Wile E. Coyote? And one of my favorites was when the coyote was in a car and was crossing a bridge, and the Roadrunner put a bunch of TNT underneath the bridge, and like right as he was going across the bridge, he pushed down on the thing, and of course it didn't work. And so the Roadrunner did that really fast, and eventually it blew up, and the coyote died for the 3,200,050th time. That's what we did with our organization at the beginning of this year. We started having conversations with people in the community, and everything needed to change. we stopped focusing on talking about people in pounds and started focusing on asking our clients what they needed in order to be self-sufficient. Abraham Lincoln is one of my favorite historical figures of all time, and I love the word that he used, emancipate. Of course, he was speaking about slavery there. But I feel like we have a personal responsibility to do what we can to emancipate people from poverty and to empower them to be self-sufficient. And so we changed everything at the beginning of this year. We started piloting last fall some cooking classes. And in these cooking classes, we worked with a local chef who came in and who taught people how to make local, fresh food from scratch, cheaper than what they could go through the drive-through at McDonald's and pay for things off the dollar menu. And what we found was astonishing. 75% of our clients that graduated from our cooking classes, at the beginning of the classes said, 75% of them, they eat fast food 4 or more times a week. Think about the economic impact of that for a moment on somebody's pocketbook. If a family of 4, even off the dollar menu, is shopping 4 times a week, and let's just say that, you know, a family of 4 gets a hamburger, fries, and a drink, that's $12 times 4 days a week is $48. That's $200 a month, and most of these families are in poverty at $1,800. So imagine putting 10 to 20% of somebody's income right back in their pocket just by teaching them how to eat better. Not to mention the health implications of it. Somebody being more healthy, somebody not being malnourished and obese, because there's significant research about how if you don't eat the right foods in the most developmental stages of your childhood in your life, you will not physically, emotionally, socially, educationally, psychologically be able to participate in society as much as those that are eating healthy and getting the nutrient-dense foods into their brains and their bodies that are important for their development. And so these cooking classes were revolutionary. They taught people how to make food. For instance, chef would set up a can of Campbell's chunky chicken soup that you could go to the store and buy for $2.50, loaded with sodium, saturated fat, processed food that's been proven to give people cancer. And then, and by the way, on another kind of politically charged, just side note here, this kind of processed food is what gets the most governmental subsidies. Side note. The other thing that chef would do is he would say, this costs $2.50, or I went to the store and bought the ingredients to make homemade chicken noodle soup from scratch tonight that we're going to make together for $1.50 a serving. So at the end of the night, when they'd make their own homemade chicken noodle soup, chef would say, you can choose to take the ingredients from this, or you can take the can of Campbell's chunky chicken soup. Which one do you want to take? And 100% of the people that graduated from our classes. And I don't say that as kind of a sleazy way to say we had people that didn't graduate. Everybody that went through the classes graduated. I just wanted to clear that up for everybody. But 100% of the people that went through the classes and graduated never took the processed food home. And interestingly enough, the stat, if I would say anything today that would cause you to remember anything, 25% of the people that graduated from these programs are no longer clients of ours at Just Food. They don't have to come get food from us anymore. Because that $200 a month that they were spending on fast food and eating unhealthy, that's now put back into their pocket. You know, I know that this is a different kind of message. To say we measure our effectiveness by not the number of people that we serve, but by the number of people that we don't serve anymore. But if we're ever going to get out of this rut of continuing to perpetuate our own existence, there are very few nonprofits across the country, friends, that are having these kinds of conversations with people in their community. Most people just come and wow you with all the things that they're doing, and everybody leaves like, wow, that's a really great organization. Nobody really ever bothers to ask the question, though, if your organization is doing so much good work, then why has the problem in your community gotten exponentially worse over the last 30 years? And that's the truth, it's gotten worse. I'm not okay with that. I don't want to continue to come to groups like this and wow you with numbers going back to my office feeling good about the work that we do, knowing that the problem is not getting any better. So we've strategically developed some things in order to move the needle the other direction that it's not been moving for the last 33 years. One of those things is a choice-based system. You hear a lot of folks say that everybody just abuses the system and that they go to all these different food pantries and that they get all this food, and that's true. They do go to all these food pantries and they do get all this food. Think about this for a moment. Let's say you're a low-income person and you go across Main Street to Healthcare Access Clinic and you visit with one of their physicians, and their physician does some blood work and looks at you and says, "Mr. Farmer, you have type 2 diabetes." For those of you that know what type 2 diabetes is, it's heavily influenced by the things that you put in your body. Imagine if you're told by a doctor you have type 2 diabetes and the doctor then looks at you and says, "Mr. Farmer, you need to eat a little bit better. All of those fatty foods, processed foods, sugary foods, you need to eat a little bit better. You need to have some more fresh vegetables and fresh fruit." And what does this low-income person do? They leave, they come over to the food bank prior to the beginning of this year, and they get a bag or box of food containing foods that are extremely high in sodium, processed foods, foods that are high in saturated fat. We were contributing to the type 2 diabetes epidemic that 75% of the clients at Healthcare Access have. So they would come to our food pantry and they would get vegetables that were high in sodium. Then they would go to Ballard Center in hopes of finding vegetables that were lower in sodium. They would go to the third food pantry, fourth food pantry, fifth food pantry, sixth food pantry, not because they were trying to hoard food, but because they were just trying to get the food that they needed in order to be healthy, so they didn't have to continue to go getting insulin shots and type 2 diabetes, spending days upon days in the hospital. All, by the way, at the expense of taxpayers in the community. You don't think these kinds of things have economic implications? They do. They do. It behooves us to have conversations about what we can do to make things better. So, we implemented a choice-based system. With this choice-based system, we worked with K-State Research and Extension to develop nutritional guidelines for the food that we were giving out. We no longer spend a dime on buying food that is processed, canned, or boxed. The vegetables that we purchase are low sodium vegetables. The fruit that we purchase is fruit cocktail soaked in its own juice. It's low sugar. We don't spend money on cereals that contain sugar, and the meat that we buy is not high in sodium. We don't buy Hamburger Helper with donor dollars. We don't buy macaroni and cheese with donor dollars. We still have people that give us that kind of food, and it's kind of